There is an experiment that has fascinated scientists for literal centuries, but it's one that no ethical researcher would ever dare to perform. It's often called the forbidden experiment. The question is simple. What happens if a human child never hears a word of language? If you took a baby, isolated them completely from society, and never spoke to them, would they eventually develop a language on their own? Would they learn after being integrated into society at a later age, or would they remain silent forever? History tells us that kings and emperors have actually tried this. Herodotus wrote about an Egyptian pharaoh who isolated two infants in a cottage to see what original language they would speak. Frederick II of Sicily supposedly did the same in the 13th century, with the children ending up dying. But these are legends, we don't really know what happened. However, in 1970, in a quiet suburb of Los Angeles, the world discovered that this experiment had unfortunately actually happened. Not in a lab, but in a private home. Authorities found a 13-year-old girl who had spent almost her entire life locked into a small room, strapped to a potty chair, having never heard a conversation. Her name was Genie, and her tragic life would become one of the most important case studies in the history of linguistics. When social workers first saw Genie on November the 4th of 1970, they didn't think she was a teenager. She weighed just 59 pounds, about 26 kilograms. She was small, frail, and moved in a strange way. The researchers called it a bunny hop. Her age was initially estimated at just 6 or 7 years. But the truth was far worse. For more than a decade, her father, a man named Clark Wiley who committed suicide shortly after Genie has been found, had kept her imprisoned in a back bedroom. During the day, she was strapped to a child's potty chair, unable to move her legs, which explained the bunny hopping. At night, she was often bound into a sleeping bag and placed in a crib with a wire mesh cover. And this isolation wasn't just physical, it was linguistic too. Her father demanded absolute silence in the house. He didn't speak to her. If she made noise, he would beat her with a wooden plank. Sometimes he would stand outside the door and instead of speaking, he barked or growled like a dog to terrify her. Her mother, who was almost blind and terrified of her husband, barely interacted with her either. So Genie grew up in a world without words. No radio, no TV, no conversation. Just silence and fear. When she was finally rescued, admitted to Children's Hospital Los Angeles, the doctors realized they were looking at a blank slate. A human being who had missed every developmental milestone of her childhood. She couldn't chew solid food. She had tunnel vision and couldn't focus her eyes on objects more than a few feet away. And of course, and unsurprisingly, she was completely silent. This was the tragedy of a stolen life. But for the scientific community, it presented a unique, if of course heartbreaking, opportunity. Could a child who had missed an often called critical window for language acquisition still learn to speak? Or was it already too late? At the time, linguistics was dominated by a theory called the critical period hypothesis, popularized by Eric Lenenberg. The idea is straightforward. The human brain has a biological deadline for learning language. According to this theory, you have until puberty, around age 12 or 13, to acquire your first language. After that, the specialized neural networks for grammar and syntax effectively shut down. So if you haven't learned by then, you never will. Genie was 13 years and 7 months old. She was the perfect, tragic test case. If Lenneberg was right, Genie shouldn't be able to learn language. But at first, it looked like the theory was wrong. Once Genie was in a safe environment, she began to blossom. She was curious, hungry for the names of things. She started learning vocabulary at a rate that surprised everyone. Doctor, door, walk. She learned hundreds of words. She could communicate her needs. She could point to a color and name it. But then the progress stopped. While her vocabulary kept growing, her grammar didn't. She could say applesauce by store or man motorcycle have, but she couldn't say the man has a motorcycle. She couldn't understand the difference between active and passive sentences. She was stuck in what linguists call telegraphic speech. This is the kind of broken, keyword-only speech that toddlers use before they master grammar. It became clear that Lenneberg was probably at least partially right. Genie proved that you can learn words at any age, but grammar, the complex, invisible rules that glue a language together, that window might actually close. What does that mean for us? Does it mean that if you didn't learn Spanish or Japanese as a child, you are doomed to sound like a toddler forever? Not quite. Today, the scientific consensus has evolved. The critical period hypothesis is still debated, but mostly accepted for first language acquisition. If you don't get that initial input as a baby, like Genie, you will most likely not be able to learn a language from scratch. But for second languages, it's different, albeit also highly debated. Most linguists now view it less as a strict cutoff and more as a sensitive period. Yes, younger is generally better for acquiring a native-like accent and perfect intuitive grammar, but adults can achieve high levels of fluency, or even native-like fluency. In fact, adults have distinct advantages. We have better analytical skills, we have motivation, we can understand abstract concepts that would baffle a child. I mean, I even made an entire video about how it's not too late to learn a second language if you're an adult. However, Genie not only missed the immersion phase, but was subjected to severe abuse and isolation, even physically punished for making sounds. On top of that, researchers remained divided on whether she was born with intellectual disabilities, and she tried to learn grammar in a lab setting, trying to memorize rules instead of absorbing patterns like a child would. So how much can be taken away from this single case regarding the critical period hypothesis is of course also debatable. Genie's brain scans later revealed something fascinating. She was using the right hemisphere of her brain for language, not the left. The left side, usually responsible for language, had atrophied from disuse. This suggests that even when the main door closes, the brain tries to find a window. But for Genie, without this early foundation, that window just wasn't enough. As if this story is not tragic enough, the window for Genie didn't just close biologically, it closed emotionally. The story of Genie Wiley does not have a happy ending. By 1974, the scientific research began to crumble. The National Institute of Mental Health, which had funded the research, pulled the grant. They argued that the quote-unquote experiment had become unscientific, that the researchers were prioritizing their own careers over Genie's well-being. And without funding, the team was disbanded. Genie's special education teachers were fired, and Genie herself became a pawn in a bitter custody battle between the scientists and her own mother, who had regained custody after getting surgery for her eyes. But her mother couldn't handle the care of a traumatized teenager, so Genie was surrendered to the state foster care system. She was bounced between a series of foster homes. In one of them, she was physically abused again. She was beaten for vomiting. Terrified, she resorted to the only defense mechanism that she knew: silence. She stopped speaking. She stopped making eye contact. All the progress, the hundreds of words, the simple sentences, the trust she had built with the researchers, it all evaporated. She regressed back into the silent, frightened child she had been when they found her. It was a devastating lesson for everyone involved. It showed that language isn't just a cognitive function you can install like software. It is deeply, inextricably linked to human connection. You need safety to speak, and with the safety being taken away, so did the language. While doing my research on this topic, I stumbled upon this Reddit comment which summarizes the story of Genie and my opinions on it fittingly. That poor little girl, she was failed by everyone. Her family, the state. No one gave her a chance, and once research money dried up, she was tossed back into the system. I hope if she's still alive, she's doing as well as she can. And Genie is still alive today. She's in her late 60s, living in a state-run care facility in Los Angeles. Her location is kept secret to protect her privacy. By all accounts, she is still largely silent. So did the forbidden experiment answer the question? What happens if a child never hears language? In a way, yes. We learned that the brain has limits. We learned that grammar is a fragile biological gift that needs to be opened early. We learned that while we can always learn words, the deep structure of language might be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. But we also learned something different, something that has nothing to do with grammar and syntax and vocabulary. Genie's tragedy wasn't just that she couldn't speak. It was that for most of her life she had no one to speak to. Language is about connection. It is the thread that ties us to other human beings. So if you are learning a language right now, whether you're struggling with grammar rules or frustrated by vocabulary, put it into perspective and remember that language is a privilege. It is the most human thing we have. Don't take it for granted.